going to tell you a story. I'm 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 going to tell you a story.
Aurora Wasteland Quarantine by Vaughn Ashby. Episode 2, Edge of Coherence Day. Intro from the narrator. So, the virus hit, and well, the world didn't end immediately. So much so that people started to question if they'd done too much. There were only ever going to be two views for people when it was all over. We did too much or we did too little. There is no middle ground. Back in the beginning, people kept using mental health as an excuse as to why they shouldn't be in lockdown, quarantines, and following the rules. And while the mental health of everyone around the world is vastly underappreciated and undervalued, the people who were using it as an excuse were the same people who were against spending money on it before the virus hit. And they will be the ones against spending money on it when it's all over. What the virus did was amplify what we already knew. We are all a lonely bunch of motherfuckers. Being alone for a lot of us is unbearable. The world had conditioned us to believe we should be constantly doing something, anything. When the virus disturbed our social lives and left us with nothing to do but hang out with the one person we'd never spent time with, ourselves, well, on occasion, things got weird. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's stay at the beginning. We were all lonely. Sure, it was to varying degrees, but we all had our stupid monkey spheres sliced into almost nothing. If you were lucky, you had someone to cohort with. Family, loved ones, delivery man. I didn't. I was alone. Those days alone are something I'll never forget. We all have our own little stories about it. We all remember the first time we didn't wear anything below the waist for a meeting. There was a lot of loneliness in those days, which is what this story is about. Welcome to the Aurora Wasteland Quarantine. Police report. Strange weeds reported growing indoors. Alberta. Property damage. RCMP. Edmonton, Alberta. Edmonton RCMP are seeking anyone who may have an unwanted plant or weed growing inside their residence. Police received complaints from weeds growing in unwanted locations yesterday in the AM. Upon investigation, they discovered all plants entered the house through the plumbing. Police are concerned that the weeds could lead to property damage and potentially weaken the stranglehold dandelions have on the mayor's front yard. Okay, I may have added the last part. Weeds are a pain in the ass, am I right? I mean, you could spend all day on your hands and knees pulling them from your garden, and they'd be back the next day in greater numbers. I can think of many other things I'd rather spend my time on my hands and knees doing. My wife wouldn't protest if I had one. The story. I took the police report, connected it with the other sources, and cross-referenced it with the Aurora Wasteland website, and well, ran with it. Below is the story I was able to piece together. As Matt dropped his laptop bag down next to the door, he wondered when the next time he'd use it. They told him in the office today that starting Monday they'd all be working from home. Something about a virus? He'd only been paying half attention. Like most staff meetings, he was distracted by the receptionist, Jess. He'd been infatuated with her since the first time he'd laid eyes on her, and in love the first time they'd spoken. He'd hoped to have his own Jim and Pam romance with her, but that never happened. Unlike Jim, the funny and aloof character from the TV show The Office, Matt lacked confidence to talk to her. He'd relegated himself to stealing a glance from her whenever he could. His plan for winning her over was weak, and he knew it. Like somehow she was going to notice him noticing her, not taking it creepy, and confess her love to him. Matt couldn't bring himself to do much more than that. He was actually looking forward to the whole working from home thing, minus the not seeing Jess, the receptionist. But hey, maybe he'd get over her, as unlikely as it seemed. Monday morning was like every other day. Matt got up, checked his phone, tugged one out before leaving the bed, showered, got dressed, then had a cup of coffee while checking his phone again. At the point when he'd get in his car and commute to work while listening to a podcast about strange and weird events, he sat down at his computer and remoted into the office. He checked his email and who was online, the same thing he'd do if he was actually sitting in the company's physical office building. Then his phone quacked. His ringtone for everything prompted him about a meeting, and the rest of his day continued on like normal. It was oddly familiar. The same but different. And what would soon become every day. Monday rolled into Tuesday, and the rest of the week, days started to blur together. Without defining evening activities, all of which had been cancelled or prohibited because of the virus, Matt had nothing to do. So like everyone, he stayed home. He woke up, tried to figure out if it was a weekday or weekend, then he'd go about doing the same thing no matter what day it was. He worked weekends for something to do. Time was beginning to pass at a snail's pace, while also blinding everyone to what day it actually was. Every night after work, Matt, with nothing else to do, watched a movie. His film selections so far had matched the world events. He watched Contagion, 28 Days Later, and Outbreak. Then he'd watch the Stand miniseries. There was a few other virus movies thrown in there, but they started to lose interest fast. Now, as time started to blur, he changed his selection. Yesterday had been Groundhog's Day, today would be a Coherence, and tomorrow would be, well, Edge of Tomorrow. All time loop movies, because the more Matt thought about it, the more his days felt like a time loop. They all felt the same, nothing changed. His work only slightly altered. If he didn't have the calendar to remind him of the actual date changes, he'd be certain he was stuck. As the credits rolled on Coherence, Matt thought about Jess, the receptionist. It had been 2 weeks since the staff meeting, and he hadn't heard anything from her. It had only been 2 weeks? It felt like it had been months. He checked the calendar on his phone. Yep, 13 days. Guess his plan for never talking to her and only randomly staring at her hadn't worked. Good to know. He'd have to change up his approach if he ever got back to normal. Normal. That was a funny concept. It didn't take long for Matt's normal to drift. By the middle of the next week, Matt was doing most of his meetings without pants on. He rightly assumed everyone else was doing the same thing. One day, he thought about going commando for a meeting, just freeballing below the screen cutoff, but that seemed like it had infinite possibilities of leading to an HR meeting. So he put the idea on pause for now. As Matt reached the end of the 3rd week, time started to feel strange. Not only was he feeling its looping effects, but also its elongation. Days felt like eternities. There was more than one occasion he could get mad at someone for taking too long on a task, only to find out he'd assigned them it earlier that day. It felt like the sun had slowed its pace across the sky and brought time with it. After 21 days, as the sun finally started to set, Matt wondered what movie he should watch. He scrolled through the options, the same way he used to walk up and down the video game aisles. He'd told himself so many times that he'd watch certain movies if only he had time. Now, here he was with all the time in the world, and he didn't want to watch any. He'd already run through it all. He thought about his day tomorrow, and how it felt like the same as today, and all the days before that. He was on a rail, just moving through life, as if some external hand was pushing him along. It felt like he wasn't making choices. But was he? He didn't know. As the sun rose on day 22 and Matt prepared his cup of coffee, he noticed something. Something different, something that would take him off his rail and change his pattern. There, in the sink staring up at him, was a weed. Its green stem weaved its way through the sink grate and poked up into the sink. Unable to take his eyes off of it, Matt leaned in closer. There was a weed growing in his sink. He was pretty sure that was weird, but he wasn't sure anymore with the whole adjustment to normal and everything. Eventually, the coffee maker beeped at Matt for taking too long to fill it with water, and Matt broke off his eye contact with the weed. As he finished making his coffee and sat down at work with no pants on, Matt's thoughts drifted to the weed in his sink. He had a meeting later in the day to go over his new design plans with a few of his other architects. He'd found that while the days had started to blend together, Matt's work had faltered. In fact, he'd found himself more productive. The meeting was about the new satellite design they were working on. Matt had been focused on the new technique for using mirrors and lights to see the Earth. Most importantly, he was working on a way to see back in time. If you travel far enough from the Earth and look back at it, you can see the past. Light travels at the speed of light. So, if you could travel faster than light, you could see back in time. Matt's design would have removed the need for travel and looped the light back on itself using mirrors, and much more technical mathy stuff, as he liked to put it. Minutes before the meeting was supposed to start, there was a knock on the front door. After over 3 weeks of not leaving his house, Matt was used to packages arriving. He watched them through his smart doorknob as the delivery man placed the package down, took a picture of it, and then left. Matt waited for his phone to let him know the package was delivered, but it never came. He opened the app and pulled up his order. There was nothing scheduled for the day. Less than a minute before the meeting, Matt jumped from his chair and grabbed the package waiting for him at the front door. It was addressed to him, but was from a company he didn't recognize. His computer chimed and reminded him about the meeting. So Matt placed the package down on his kitchen counter and forgot all about it as his meeting began. The package sat there unopened or thought about for the duration of the morning. It wasn't until there was another knock at the door that Matt thought about it again. Again, he watched through the smart doorknob as the package was left and photographed. Then again, Matt went out and got it. He placed the package down on the counter next to the first. Maybe someone had bought him something, like a mystery box or something. Only 2 packages in a single day seemed odd. Again, work pulled Matt away and he left both boxes on the counter unattended. As the workday began to run down, there was a third knock at the door. This time, out of sheer interest, Matt sprinted from his computer and ran to the front door, where he startled the delivery man who was just about to take a picture of the box. Matt asked who the man was, and where the packages were coming from. The man only replied with a laugh and told Matt, "Good one," then snapped the picture he needed and left. Matt watched as the man got back in his truck, which was smaller than most delivery trucks Matt had witnessed. It looked more like a mom-and-pop shop truck. Across the back was written Moe's. Confused, Matt returned to the kitchen and opened all 3 boxes. He was as excited as a kid on Christmas morning. Inside was nothing but unassembled parts. None of the boxes came with instructions on how to assemble it. Again, he thought it must be some kind of mystery box. Maybe worker got it for him? He placed the boxes full of random electronic and mechanical parts on the floor and went about the rest of his day, though his thoughts returned to the box often. On day 34, the collection of 3 boxes had grown to a mountain. The delivery man was still dropping off 3 per day. He was also giving out the vaguest of information. Matt had figured out that the man's name was Vince, and had worked for a company called Moe's Custom Builds. Matt had even tried flirting with Vince in the hopes of coercing him out of some information. Vince didn't buy it, and Matt knew no more than he knew before the first box. All the boxes were the same, no instructions, and what appeared to be random parts. On day 55, the package stopped arriving. Matt never saw Vince again. He wondered if he finally had everything he needed to figure out exactly what had been shipped to him. He took all the pieces out and laid them down in the kitchen, living room, hallway, bedroom, and eventually bathroom. There was a lot more parts than he thought there'd be. He meandered through his house sorting the pieces. He grouped them by what he thought they did. Then, more precise breakdowns about what they actually did. Day after day, he found himself randomly zoning out and staring at the parts. He'd find himself standing at pieces he didn't even remember existing. Occasionally, he'd move parts around without even remembering he did it. Work became somewhat of an issue, and he found himself taking vacation and personal days, mostly because he spent entire days just lost staring at the parts. At some point, the days for Matt started to blend together without him knowing it. On day 89, Matt woke up to something he had no memory of creating. As he crossed the kitchen to acquire his much-needed coffee, something across the room startled him. 2 large pieces of glass stood parallel to each other, no more than a foot or 2 apart. Forgoing his need for coffee, Matt approached them. The pieces from around his house were gone. All of them seemed to be used around the 2 large pieces of glass that, the closer he got, he realized weren't glass at all. They were mirrors. 2 large mirrors facing inwards towards each other. Behind each was a hum of a machine doing shit he had no idea. The 2 machines were joined by a number of large cables, all of which were plugged into a single outlet on the wall. Matt stared at the machine, the mirrors, and wondered, had he made this? What was this thing? What did it do? What felt like hours passed as Matt examined the device in his living room. Eventually, his stomach reminded him about the coffee he was supposed to make hours ago, and Matt abandoned the device and headed straight for the coffee maker. As he filled the coffee pot with water, Matt noticed the weed in the sink. It was still there, still growing. In fact, it was substantially larger than the last time he noticed it. It rose a few inches out of the drain. He smiled at it as he ran his finger along the stem. He thought of Jess, the receptionist, and wondered how she was doing. It had been too long since they'd talked. Coffee in hand, Matt found his phone buried under papers on the desk and typed a message to Jess. His finger hung above the send button. It had been a long time. What if she didn't even know who he was? What if he deleted the message and stared at the machine in his living room? What should he say to her? Maybe he should just say hi. Or maybe something about the weather? No, it had already been too long. He had to tell her how he felt. But how did he feel? He thought he might love her, but maybe that wasn't true anymore. Without overthinking it any longer, he typed a message and hit send. Then the machine in his living room started to hum. The mirrors glowed with a harsh light that seemed to override the sunlight coming through his windows. Matt set his phone down on his desk and stepped towards the machine. The light felt different as he approached it, like it was passing through him. He stepped between the mirrors and could see the reflection of his reflection echoing off in each direction. Infinite Matt's doing exactly what he was doing. He turned and looked in the other mirror. It was the same thing. It reminded him of his grandmother's bathroom. She had a mirror above the sink and a mirror on the door. When the door was open, you could see copies and copies of yourself forever. This felt so much like that, but even larger, longer, more infinite. On day 89, as Matt stared into the mirrors of the device he didn't remember creating, something happened that altered his life forever. Hands from the mat behind him reached through the mirror and pulled him in. At first, everything felt the same, except the light felt a little off. It wasn't as harsh as before, but as Matt looked around the room, it seemed like he was still in his home. The device was still standing there, built. Everything was as it should be, except he glanced over the side of the sink to see the weed. It was substantially smaller than just seemed minutes ago. What had happened to it? He reached down to touch it, but before he could, his fingers passed through it. Like he was a ghost. Had the machine killed him? He had, after all, walked into the device he'd built somehow without knowing about it. Then something every Paradox movie warns you about happened. Matt saw himself walk back from his front door carrying a box. He watched himself set it down, investigate it, then get distracted by work, all while not noticing Matt himself standing there in the middle of his house. Was that the first delivery? How had the other Matt not seen him? What the heck was happening to him? As the other Matt went about his meeting, the real Matt returned to the machine. It was still running. Could the other him not see it? Matt pressed his hand against the mirror surface and watched as his hand passed through. He tried to pull it back out, but every inch of him that he passed through the surface seemed to be stuck on the other side. The other side? What was on the other side? Matt squinted through and could see another copy of his house, along with another copy of him working at his computer. With his hands already partly through, Matt allowed the rest of his body to pass through the mirror surface. This time the weed in the sink was larger than before. Its head and stem rose higher than the sink itself. There was even a meter stick attached to it to measure its height. Another Matt was sitting at his computer. This one had a beard that was way longer than he'd ever let it get. It actually looked kinda good. Matt made a mental note of that. Unsure of what to do and getting a little bored, Matt returned to the machine and stepped through it again. He repeated the process over and over again. Sometimes he'd be further in the future, sometimes the past. He never found a day that he wasn't at home. At one point, while watching the future version of himself enjoy a bowl of cereal, Matt touched the spoon, and by accident the other Matt's hand. For a second he feared he may have caused the world to end, and the universe to collapse in on itself. But it didn't. Something else happened entirely. For about 34 seconds, Matt was able to control the other Matt's body. He could taste and feel everything the other Matt tasted and felt. The cereal, his balls. The cereal and his balls could attest to it. The only hitch was, he could only seem to take over the body once each journey through the mirror. 34 seconds wasn't long enough to really do anything. He also hadn't been able to find a way to control where he was going. It seemed random. Plus, he hadn't gone back to the same day twice in a row. He often found himself visiting days where the parts from the machine were scattered around the house. But for 34 seconds of touching per day in a random day order, it made it impossible to help the other Matt build anything. He'd been certain that it had been him that had helped the past version of himself to put it together. But based on what he'd experienced, he'd likely been a hinder. Time became even more strange and unreal than before. Well, it seemed like previously he'd been stuck in some sort of Groundhog's Day loop. Now he was stuck in an unending day of repeating previous days over. He didn't sleep. He had no night. Everything was running together, even his thoughts. He watched as the weed in the sink changed, like a flipbook showing out of order. It shot up and down. Sometimes it wasn't even there yet. But more so, it was getting larger and larger. Time was different. What felt like hundreds of years passed. Matt wasn't even 100% sure what day he'd started his journey on. Even if he could go back, he didn't know how he would. He thought about God, the universe, life, all the deep stuff. Eventually he wondered if maybe he was God. Even if that seemed crazy, he might be a little crazy. Living like this wasn't normal. The human brain wasn't designed to live alone. Time again became entirely different. Matt visited days he never thought could exist. According to the weed, he visited day 10,946. He'd hoped that when all this started, that the lockdown, quarantine, virus would be over within a few months. He was wrong. Day 10,946 was way past a few months. Matt watched the other Matt continue to go about his normal life. He still had coffee, and his life seemed to have transitioned to just never having pants on. As the other Matt worked, original Matt, if you could call him that, sat and stared at the machine. He was tired. He wanted out. Something outside the window caught his attention. Something was standing and staring through one of the house windows. Matt got up to look at it, only it wasn't really an it. He didn't know what it was. The shape was human, but there was no face, no clothing, no nothing. Blackness that was closer to being the absence of color made up the being. Matt waved. The being didn't wave back. It only stood there, watching, unmoving. But Matt could feel it looking at him. The other Matt seemed to not notice the being standing there at his window. Matt wondered if he couldn't see it. The longer Matt stared at it, the longer he felt uncomfortable. He moved back to the machine, glanced back at the being, and then stepped through the mirror. Day 196,418 greeted him on the other side. The length of time that was from when he started boggled his mind. Then he did the math. It was impossible. He should be dead. Long dead, actually. There was no possible way for him to still be alive. He glanced at the window. The being was still there, as were his friends. Every window in the house had a similar being standing there, watching Matt. Chills ran down his back to his butt. Matt clenched as he spun around the room. The Matt from day 196,418 filled his coffee and sat down for work. This had to be wrong. This couldn't be his future. Matt should be dead. Those people, or whatever they were, shouldn't be standing there observing him. He looked up at the machine. It had to be wrong. It must be guessing at what the future might be. Maybe he was too far for it to guess correctly. But what did that matter? It didn't help Matt get back to the first day he stepped into the mirror. In the distance, he could hear quacking, 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 quacking. He looked up at the beans in the window. They continued to look at him. Why was there quacking? He approached the machine. The quacking seemed to be coming from within it. Why was there quacking coming from the machine? Then, some half-memory from a lifetime ago fell into place. The quacking was his phone. He had the same ringtone for everything. Or rather, he used to. Matt stood between the mirrors and squinted through them, trying to see where the quacking was coming from. Then, just as before, hands reached through and grabbed him. Only this time he recognized them. They were his hands. His own hands from another version of himself was pulling him into the mirrors. Then, like so many times before, Matt fell into the mirror. He stumbled out into his living room, like always. Only the quacking sound was infinitely louder. His phone buzzed and quacked on his desk. He glanced into the sink as he made his way to his phone. The weed was tiny, just as he remembered it a long time ago. Matt picked up his phone and stared at the screen. It felt so familiar. A message popped up. It was from Jess, the receptionist. She wanted to know if he wanted to grab a coffee sometime. Newspaper headlines. Local startup wins NASA satellite grant. Edmonton Epoch. Moe's custom builds aid in satellite design contest. Brightness Falls Gateway. Weeds plague during plague. Calgary Science Digest. Matt and Jess getting married over Zoom. Matt's mom's family newsletter. Space agencies ask you to stop flashing your junk into space. You never know who's watching. Lethbridge Dark Times. Conclusion from the narrator. That's it. Being alone blows. Who knew? I mean, I think we all did, but like a lot of things in life, we did little to prepare for it. We often deal with the undesired outcome instead of fixing the root problem. Like Matt, we need more in our lives. Becoming lost in work isn't a valid way to spend indefinite time alone. Like the machine in Matt's living room, humans are complicated machines. We need more than just ourselves to really make us blossom, even if that's multiple time-traveling copies of ourselves.
Hey, my name is Vaughn Ashby. I wrote this. If you liked what you heard, head on over to VaughnAshby.com/free and pick up a free novel or a bunch of other free stuff. Go explore the Aurora Wasteland yourself at AuroraWasteland.com. Don't forget to check out the Stories from the Wasteland podcast and search for Vaughn Ashby on YouTube for video versions and other exciting videos. Thanks for listening.